Hey everybody, I'm Grandmaster Ben Finegold here with our weekly lecture series. Tonight's lecture is on hanging pawns, which for a lot of you isn't what you think it is. Hanging pawns is sort of a misnomer, but it's a pretty cool name for something that is part of a pawn structure. And Wikipedia has an article I've never seen before on pawn structure. It's a very long article which talks about 30 to 40 different pawn structures. And hanging pawns is one of them. So I have the monitor set to that one. Some other things there. It's not very large. I want to thank our sponsor, Shane. Hopefully he doesn't leave, because if he does, I'll have to say, come back, Shane. Hopefully he gets the reference since his name is Shane. Although, if he's under the age of 60, maybe he won't. Okay, so if you can see the Wikipedia article on hanging pawns, it talks about like what they are, and I don't really care about that. I'll talk about that during the lecture, but I want to show an example of the diagram that it has, where white's pawns are on d4 and c4, and there's no pawns on adjacent files. Hanging pawns don't need to be white pawns. They can be black pawns, which we're going to see in the lecture. Hanging pawns are neither good nor bad. And that's actually one of the questions that the sponsor had asked. I'm going to read the questions before the lecture and then talk about them during the lecture. So hanging pawns can come from basically any opening. And basically the pawns are on the fourth rank adjacent, and they can't be protected by other pawns, although they could be protected by each other, which is unusual because the pawns next to each other are usually controlling more squares than if you start moving your pawns, overextend. So for reasons I don't understand, even though I've been playing chess for over 50 years, 99% of the time, hanging pawns are D and C pawns. And I guess you could argue if they're not D and C pawns, they're not hanging pawns. Wikipedia says they are. It says it doesn't matter where the pawns are as long as it's two pawns next to each other on the fourth rank and there's no pawns on adjacent files. I've never seen hanging pawns that weren't on the D and C files. That's just the way chess is. Maybe during the lecture we'll see an example. And hanging pawns is a pretty cool term. Neither one's defended by another pawn. They're out in the center there, can be attacked. So, okay. I want to discuss the questions that sponsor had. Sponsor wrote, I don't know much about hanging pawns. Can they be an advantage or a strength like isolated pawns can? The answer is yes. Hanging pawns are neither good nor bad. It just depends on the position. If so, can you address playing with and against hanging pawns? Yes. And the examples that I have today from Grandmaster games, sometimes the side with hanging pawns wins, sometimes they lose. Also, I heard from Ronan Harzvi, St. Louis lectures, and I've actually done commentary with Ronan, that when you trade off an isolated pawn, you often have an advantage. Is this strategy viable when you have hanging pawns? And the answer is, it depends. Typically, with hanging pawns, white or black, whoever has the hanging pawns, may move the D pawn to get a past D pawn and open up their bishop. And sometimes that trades pawns, and then we have a different pawn structure completely. We have a passed pawn and isolated pawn. And that, again, that depends on the position. And when we see the games, we'll discuss that. So basically, there's no answer to your questions. The answer is it depends. So I hope that helped. Okay, so I saw an article on the internet that showed positions with hanging pawns, but the article didn't show the opening. It just showed the starting position of hanging pawns. That's not good, because I want you guys to see how it happens, how hanging pawns come about. Now, before I look at the games I'm going to look at, the first game is Karpov Smyslov, two former world champions, played in 1981 when Karpov was the world champion. Before I show the games, I want to show the kind of pawn structure that you're going to see with hanging pawns. And a lot of times we have these four pawns in the center, d4, c4, d5, and c5. And one side or both sides fianchetto their bishop, because the bishop doesn't really have anywhere to go. So fianchetto is good. Now, if the players want to, if they don't want to, they don't want to. Either side can get hanging pawns. And both sides have to cooperate. That's fine. So white might say, I like when my opponent has hanging pawns. I like attacking those hanging pawns. So white takes, and black could take with the knight or the pawn. They're both fine. Let's take with the pawn. That way we can get hanging pawns. And now, in this position, if black plays bishop takes c5, black has an isolated pawn, and white can blockade on the d4 square. And I think 95% of grandmasters would say white has an advantage here, because black has an isolated pawn, but doesn't really have an initiative. So most grandmasters probably take with the pawn, and now black has hanging pawns. Now, hanging pawns is more of a personal thing. If I told you giving up your queen is bad, and then you gave your queen away, and you were down a queen, and you resigned, probably it's an accident. You probably didn't give your queen away on purpose. However, there is the small percentage of the time where you do give your queen away on purpose and you're winning. That's pretty rare. But it's so rare that a chess coach might say, don't give away your queen. Other things like isolated pawns, doubled pawns, hanging pawns, bishop versus knight, depending on the position. A lot of that is personal preference. And there's not really good or bad. And telling you something is bad, it might be bad 52% of the time, so it doesn't really matter. Every position is different. And so if you play a lot of chess and you have games where you have hanging pawns and your opponent has hanging pawns, other games, you may notice your results vary. Maybe when you have hanging pawns, you score 20%. When your opponent has hanging pawns, you score 70%. Because that's the kind of person you are. That's the kind of positions you like. So if you're white and you're scoring 70% in your games when your opponent has hanging pawns, you might play this way with white because you want to give your opponent hanging pawns. It could be the other way around, and you like when you have hanging pawns. You don't like when they do. So you play rook c1, and now if both sides cooperate, then white has hanging pawns. Maybe you like that. It's not good or bad, just you like it or you don't like it. Now, when they're hanging pawns, typically the side that doesn't have the hanging pawns wants to attack the pawns. So we can play knight a5, pressuring the c pawn, and rook c8, pressuring the c pawn, and bishop a6, and so forth. Or we could move our knight, I don't know where, and then play bishop f6 and threaten the d pawn. White might just keep his pawns on d4 and c4, controlling all these squares, and at some point may decide to play aggressively and play d5. Then the pawns aren't hanging because they're defending each other, they're not next to each other. And that changes, then there's no more hanging pawns, it changes to something else. And is that good or bad? It depends. And a friend of mine who passed away about 5 years ago, Grandmaster Luc Winans from Belgium, I met him when I lived in Belgium before you guys were born. He told me when he prepared for a Grandmaster tournament, this is 35 years ago, he didn't do opening prep, which is like what I do. He looked at positions with different pawn structures so he could play those structures better than if he didn't. And one of the structures he looked at, he said he looked at a lot of games with hanging pawns. That way, if those structures occurred in his games, he would have an idea what people did to win games. So if somehow you got a database of 50 games with hanging pawns, and you were like, the side with hanging pawns, they do better when this happens, and the side without hanging pawns does better when this happens, you notice a pattern in the games that you're looking at. Or you might just notice that the higher rated player is killing it. It could be you have 50 games and the higher rated player scoring 40 out of 50. Doesn't matter if they have hanging pawns or not. That wouldn't surprise me. The higher rated players play better. So don't care if they have hanging pawns or not, they just play better. Okay. This is the typical hanging pawns in that white has D and C pawns on D4 and C4. Black doesn't have D and C pawns. And there's no B pawn and there's no E pawn. In this position, there are no hanging pawns because white and black both have B and D and E pawns. So pawns are defended. Okay. So that's my spiel about how hanging pawns can occur. The first game I'm going to look at, I think if I asked 100 grandmasters, some of them would say this is not an example of hanging pawns, but most of them would. Because in an unusual happenstance, Smyslov, who has black, Karpov has the hanging pawns. He actually has a C pawn. And that's very rare. When one side has hanging pawns, the other side has a C pawn. That's a rare instance. That's what happens this game. We get hanging pawns from a transposition from a Grunfeld. Okay. No hanging pawns yet. I've had white and black in this position. I've had this position with both colors. I've played bishop g4. Okay, b3. So you can see white's played b3, c4, d4, e3. So there's a possibility for hanging pawns. And typically, which I showed the last game that I made up, black's playing c5, and we're trading these pawns and giving white hanging pawns. This game was different. Okay, so both sides are playing sort of boring. Nobody's trading anything yet. And finally, black plays e5 and takes on d4. Okay, so white has hanging pawns. And you could argue this is an atypical hanging pawn position because black's pawn is on c6. If I move the pawn over to e6, now that's hanging pawns. That's a standard, nobody would argue. Here, it's still hanging pawns. The pawns are in the same place. White doesn't have any pawns protecting them. The E pawn and the B pawn are gone. But black has a pawn on c6, which is weird. So that's atypical for hanging pawns. Okay, now other things are important. Hanging pawns are good because they control the center. They're controlling a lot of the, and also they're controlling a lot of the other side of the board. And you don't want that when your opponent has hanging pawns and they're controlling your side of the board. You don't like that. White also has the 2 bishops. Okay, and if black ever plays c5, attacking the center, that improves my bishop on f3, and my passed pawn on d5 is going to be pretty strong. Nice to have a passed pawn in the center. So it's hard for black to attack white's hanging pawns, and white has 2 bishops. So I like white, and Karpov's white. Karpov usually knows what he's doing. Smyslov, with the black pieces, plays very solid. He doesn't play aggressive and try to play for tactics. He usually plays for equality. So he's just saying this is equal, I can just chill. Now, I can tell you good things to do, because that's what I should do in a lecture. But also, a good lecturer tells you bad things to do, so you don't do them. White does not want to play c5, because then the pawns can't move, and you give up some of the white squares, the pawns defending the white squares here, and you give away the d5 square. And that's not hanging pawns anymore. Hanging pawns are next to each other. And if you ask me, does white want to play d5, the answer is maybe. Because d5 gives away the c5 square to the knight, but it gives me a passed d pawn, and it puts pressure on black's queen side. So I wouldn't complain if Karpov played d5 soon. If Karpov plays c5 soon, I'll do a double take. Karpov's not playing c5. Okay, well, first things first, the b pawn's hanging. So rook b8, defending the b pawn. Rook d1, the rooks are defending the hanging pawns. The hanging pawns can't be attacked. White has 2 bishops. White controls the center more with the pawns. So I like white. Queen c7, boring. Queen a3. I don't think white wants to take on a7. Probably gets his queen trapped. So I'm not sure why white played queen a3. That's not one of the first moves I would think of. Bishop f8, attacking the queen. Queen b2, that makes sense, giving battery. And black played c5. c5 is a big decision, and in my opinion, Smyslov didn't like his position and thought he had to attack the hanging pawns. Now, Karpov has a tough decision here. Should Karpov leave the pawn on d4 and say, wow, my bishop's really good? Or should Karpov play d5 and say, wow, my passed pawn's really good? I don't know. Okay, that's why Karpov's better than me. And Smyslov thought, if Karpov doesn't play d5, I'll take this pawn, and then white has 2 isolated pawns. And if Karpov plays d5, he blocks his bishop, I can block the passed pawn, and my knight has access to e5. Because these pawns were controlling black's side of the board, and now white has to make a big decision. Okay, I don't know what the right decision is, but Karpov won the game, so I guess he made the right decision. He played bishop d5. He said, I have the 2 bishops. I don't care about the isolated pawns. My bishops are really strong. Okay, bishop g7. Black wants to put more pressure on d4. They trade everything. And now black has a better pawn structure. White has 2 isolated pawns. But there's no arguing that that's a monster bishop on d5. And this is why chess is difficult, because something is happening and then things change, and you have to decide whether that change is good or bad. And the main way to get good at that is to play a lot of chess and have a lot of experience. So black can say, I traded a lot of pieces off, my knight's really good on c5, and white has two isolated pawns. And white can say, my bishop on d5 is the greatest piece ever, and my rook can go to f3, and I have an attack on my opponent's king. And then somebody's going to be right. And a lot of times, grandmasters are so good at chess that they're both right, and we see a lot of draws. Lower rated players aren't as good at chess, low rated, and they make a lot of mistakes, and so there's a lot of blundering. Nobody's blundering here, material's equal, but the position changes. You go from a position with hanging pawns to one where there's no hanging pawns, and all of a sudden white has a great bishop. And that was all done by Smyslov. Black is the one who played c5 and bishop g7 and got rid of the hanging pawns, got rid of the two bishops, and is trading and improving black's pawn structure. Now, if white doesn't get an attack, eventually, in maybe 20 moves, black's going to have the advantage because white's going to have these two isolated pawns. Okay, rook f3, attacking f7, rook e7, h4, white wants to attack on the king side. h5, h6, queen g7 mate. Not easy for Smyslov to defend because Smyslov's pieces are on the queen side. Queen f6, knight e4, let's get rid of that bishop. He says, no, I like my bishop. h5, white wants to play h6, or white wants to take on g6, hg, rook h3, and give mate on h8. White's pieces are too active, and even though Smyslov got rid of Karpov's two bishops, his remaining bishop is too good. Knight d7, Smyslov decides he needs to blockade on e5. So if h6, I can play queen e5 or knight e5. Takes. Rook g3, threatening the g6 pawn because the f pawn is pinned. So if it was white's turn to move, white would play rook takes g6 check. Smyslov has to stop that. So he played queen e5, which doesn't stop it. Rook g6. I guess the problem with black's position, if black plays king h7, then queen h4 check wins the rook. And if he plays knight e5, I can just play f4, and your knight has to move away from your g-pawn. So basically, there's no defense. And this is funny, Karpov played rook g3, because if black trades queens, hoping not to get checkmated, now white's going to checkmate him. Checkmate in the endgame. The truth hurts. Also, white's a pawn up. Knight f6, check. And this position, black resigned. If queen h5, I guess I would take the knight, you take my rook, I play king h2, and now I'm threatening all kinds of checkmates and your rook. I don't like black's position. Black plays queen h5 check, rook h3 wins the queen. So this is just hopeless. And if you play knight h5, I play rook g5, and the truth hurts. So this is why chess is a complicated game, because if you ask me to do a lecture on a specific topic and we get to those positions that meet your criteria, it could be in 10 moves, the topic of the lecture doesn't look like the position anymore. So it's hanging pawns until it's not. And in this game, Smyslov decided, I'm going to get rid of the hanging pawns and get rid of white's two bishops. And by doing that, he allowed Karpov's bishop to go to d5. and then Karpov crushed him. Truth hurts. In 1981, Karpov was the best player in the world, and Smyslov was a bit older. Smyslov was about 60. So Smyslov, best chess was in the 50s and 60s, not in the 80s. Although he was still a candidate in the 80s. God damn. Okay. So one advantage turns into another, and the hanging pawns, which were good for white, Smyslov eliminated them, but that gave Karpov other advantages, and Karpov won easily. Not too surprising, since Karpov was the best player in the world. Much higher rated than Smyslov, who was much older. Okay, the next game is a famous game. Except the fact that there's hanging pawns is not famous. The end of the game is famous. This is a game, Bernstein versus Capablanca, played in 1914. Okay, and they got that pawn structure, which I showed you earlier. And you can see who has hanging pawns this game. And it's black. Okay. So black has hanging pawns. That's the standard hanging pawns. And white in this particular position isn't putting pressure on the pawns. So when you have a hanging pawn situation, the side with the hanging pawns has an open B file and an open E file for their rooks. White has open C file and open D file for their rooks, putting pressure on the pawns. Right now, there's virtually no pressure on the pawns, and Bernstein's king is on E1, so got a castle before you start attacking. So white's plan is pretty obvious. Castles, rook D1, and start attacking these pawns any way you can. Queen A3, queen D3, rook D1, knight A4, knight to D3. And again, if Capablanca is going to move one of the pawns, which we discussed in the previous game, it's going to be D4. Capablanca is not going to play C4, giving away the D4 square. Okay, so white castled, queen B6. Black wants to get rid of his isolated A pawn and hopes that they trade. Now it's nice pawn structure. It's not hanging pawns anymore, and we've activated our rook. And one of the negatives of black's position is the pawn on A7 is isolated. Now, of course, black's threatening the queen and the pawn, so Bernstein has to do something about that. So he plays queen E2, defending his pawn. And Capablanca, going against what I taught, plays the move C4. He says, I don't care if you play knight D4, because I want to activate my bishop. I want my knight to go to E4. And since I have the open B file, I don't want you to play B3. I want to play rook B8 and take your pawn. So C4 is a big decision. I'm not sure the engine would like it. But this position looks pretty staid. It doesn't look like anybody's better. And Capablanca can't be drawing somebody you guys never heard of. So he has to mix it up. So these are not hanging pawns anymore because this pawn's defended. So this is an unusual sequence where because black doesn't have a white squared bishop, black doesn't mind putting his pawns on the white squares. He's not blocking his bishop. His bishop's gone. And his other bishop has a lot of scope now. Rook D1, attacking the pawn. Rook D8. Knight D4, as I indicated. Bishop B4. And white played B3. White is attacking the center pawns. White wants to trade these two pawns and leave black with an isolated pawn. Okay, and black wants to keep a passed pawn, this pawn's almost passed now because the b2 pawn is not there anymore. So he plays rook c8, keeping his passed pawn. And the hanging pawns have turned into a passed pawn. They've also turned into an isolated pawn. And when a pawn is isolated and passed, and you ask me, is that good or bad? It depends. Sometimes you promote your pawn to a queen, and sometimes the guy takes your isolated pawn. Okay, in this position, that pawn looks pretty safe so far. Black seems pretty active. Okay, rook c2. He takes so his knight can come in. c3. That pawn's looking pretty strong. Always repeat. And white blunders and takes the pawn. Now, if white doesn't blunder, then white's just worse, because I'm threatening the knight. My rook can go to c8. I'm going to play knight b4. So knight takes c3 is a blunder, and it's very famous. If you've memorized any famous positions throughout chess history, this should be top 10. I'm not saying you have memorized any, but if you have, this is one of them. And this is why Capablanca is considered one of the greatest players ever, and you've never heard of Ossip Bernstein. There's another Bernstein named Sidney Bernstein, who actually lived in New York, who's also a master. Ossip Bernstein was better, but Sidney Bernstein wasn't bad either. Okay, so knight takes c3. Now you know why they're called hanging pawns. They're gone. White took all of them. Okay, but Capablanca said, I'm Capablanca. So truth hurts. Trade everything, and now Capablanca made a very famous move. And this position, for those of you on YouTube who are watching after the fact, you may recognize this position even if you didn't know the game. Okay, both sides have a weak back rank. So if black plays the obvious queen b1 check, queen f1, rook d1, then white plays rook c8 with mate. Both sides have a weak back rank. If either side had luft, they would be winning easily. But neither side has luft, so both sides have to watch out for the back rank. Okay, so here black played a brilliant move, winning the game, queen b2, confusing the audience, mainly confusing Bernstein. Okay, black is threatening queen takes queen and queen takes rook. Obviously, queen takes queen hangs mate. If you play queen e1, defending your rook and saving your queen, you didn't really defend your rook. I can take it, I still have rook d1 mate. If you play rook c2, now I play queen b1, and the aforementioned queen f1 hangs the rook. So after queen b2, there's nothing you can do. You can't save your queen and your rook and back rank mate. Bernstein resigned. So Capablanca won pretty quickly by playing unusual c4, then playing c3, and his hanging pawn got to the 6th rank, was a dangerous passed pawn, and it was a poison pawn when Bernstein captured it. And that's a famous finish. Many of you on YouTube have seen that before. Okay, and this is a game between two famous players from a long time ago, Max Euwe, former world champion, Sammy Reshevsky. In the first two examples that I showed you, the side with the hanging pawns won. That's not fair. What about the side that doesn't have the hanging pawns? All right, so this was played in Zurich 53, which is a very famous tournament book written by David Bernstein. So a lot of you that have this book have seen this game. Many great games from that tournament, lots of super grandmasters. Okay, this is a Nimzo Indian. Nobody has hanging pawns yet. Very strange. Reshevsky played d6, then d5. That was weird. And this is funny because if I take with a pawn and you trade, black has hanging pawns. Although this pawn's on c3, which is weird. If pawn was on b2, that would be a more common example of hanging pawns. But Reshevsky took with the queen, threatening queen takes g2 mate. Sometimes your opponent falls asleep and you checkmate them. Okay, so knight f4, defending mate, attacking the queen. c4, they trade, and white has hanging pawns. This is your standard hanging pawn position, and white has the two bishops. On the other hand, unlike the previous hanging pawn positions, the d pawn's not defended. And the c pawn can be attacked by the queen, the bishop, one of the rooks, etc. So black has chances to attack these hanging pawns. Knight d7, completing development. Rook e8, black wants to play e5, trade the pawns, and give white two isolated pawns. So rook e1, stopping that. Rook c8, rook c1. So, which side is better? The answer is neither side is better. But again, chess is a game where if the engine says all zeros, you still usually prefer somebody's position as your personal preference. It could be Reshevsky loved playing against hanging pawns. It could be Euwe loved playing with isolated pawns. Maybe they're both happy. They both think they're better. Most grandmasters realize that the engines always say these positions are all zeros because nobody's won anything and everybody's pieces are all on good squares. So they're able to play both sides of the position. Now, if I was playing this game as a grandmaster, I'm required to prefer white because white has the two bishops. So I like bishops. And eventually, white can play d5 and open up his bishop. That seems very scary to me. The other problem is I don't see what black can do here. Okay, one of black's main ideas, maybe he did it, is play b5, and then when the c pawn is gone, my knight has the d5 square. Then white can decide to get a passed pawn or win a pawn. So b5 just looks like it loses a pawn now. Okay, he played knight f8. That indicates to me he wants to play knight g6. White can't trade knights because queen g2 is still mate. Bishop f1, defending against the queen g2 mate. Always play bishop f1, knight g6. They trade. White still has the two bishops. So I can't really attack your hanging pawns, but your hanging pawns can't move. That's why the engine always says it's equal. Okay, rook e3, doing a rook lift. Rook d8, queen e2. Nobody's doing very much, just sort of moving around. Okay, and finally, somebody does something with these hanging pawns. He starts attacking them. Okay, and that's one of the main ideas, if you're playing against the hanging pawns, is to attack them. Rook f3 attacking the queen. Keeps attacking the queen. C pawn is attacked still. Finally, white defends the pawn. And now it's obvious that black's better because white is taking all of his pieces and defending a pawn. That's not what you want to do when you play chess, is take your rooks and defend a pawn with them. You want your rooks to be active like black's rooks. So since the hanging pawns were never able to move forward and black is able to play bishop a6 and attack the c pawn, Reshevsky's better. Basically, this pawn is weak. And then knight d5 is a nice tactic because the c pawn is pinned. And if you move your rook away, then I take on c4. Then black is completely winning. Black has an extra pawn. White has two isolated pawns, and black's knight's on d5. So white sacks the exchange. If black takes with the rook, bishop d2 pins the rook. White still has the two bishops. White takes the bishop on a6, but rook c2 gets the bishop back. This was all well calculated by Reshevsky. Sacrifices his queen, hoping to push one of those hanging pawns to queen. Queen d5. Now, the game could have ended in a funny way. Black could have taken the bishop on b2, then white has perpetual. White queens would check, king h7, queen h4 check, queen d8, queen h4, perpetual. So, but queen d5 just wins. And after king takes f2, then white resigned. Because after queen takes pawn, black's up a queen. So, truth hurts. So in that game, white never got an initiative. Eventually, black targeted the c4 pawn, attacked it with his bishop, his rook, his other rook, played the tactic knight d5, which Euwe miscalculated, and black won. Okay, last but not least, this is a game played between, I think, two people who also played in Zurich 53, but this was played in Yugoslavia 1958, when Yugoslavia was a country. Gligoric versus Keres. Okay, and those were two of the top 10 players in the world. And what's funny is I've played Gligoric. God damn. I played him in 1988 in Canada, and we played like a 13-move draw. I was young and foolish, and he was old and foolish. He was way past his prime. He's still higher rated than me. Okay, so Gligoric is white. You'll notice most of the hanging pawn games are queen pawn openings. Okay, and black can take on d5 with the pawn, but didn't want his bishop blocked, so he took the knight. And then c4, and white has hanging pawns. Okay, and then queen went back to d6. So white has the hanging pawns, and white has the two bishops. Although black's bishop on b7 is pretty good. On the other hand, we got to attack these pawns. Otherwise, they'll be like Karpov. Two bishops, nice pawns. Okay, and black decides he wants to put his knight on f4. Seems like a good square. And white played d5. White said, I have the two bishops, and I'm going to sacrifice a pawn because I have a big attack. With the knight on h5, sometimes white can play bishop h7 check, knight g5 check, queen takes h5, or white can just play knight g5 first, attacking h7 and h5. The knight on f6 was defending d5, so now it's a good time to play d5 and open up the bishop. A really nice pawn sacrifice from Gligoric. On the other hand, if we don't take the pawn and white's able to capture on e6, that ruins black's pawn structure. So he played knight c5 because, as I pointed out in previous games, when white gets rid of their hanging pawns by moving one of them, that gives away squares. Pawn on d4 was protecting c5, and now it's not, so black plays knight c5. Knight g5, white has a huge attack against black's king. G6, blocking everything, defending everything. Bishop E2, threatening the knight. Queen D4, threatening queen takes G7 checkmate. You can't play knight F5, forking, because queen H8 is mate. So he plays queen F8, defending. Queen H4, threatening queen H7 mate. Bishop G4, attacking E6. Obviously, if you take, queen H7's mate. And now this pawn is attacked a lot. And the pawn's pinned to the rook. And white has the two bishops. So D5, which gave away the C5 square to black's knight, worked out in white's favor because white's threatening E6, opens up his bishop. F5, blocking the bishop. Knight takes E6, crashing through. Now white's threatening E7. White sacks a piece because the G file and H file are open. If you take, then white completely wins. I can play rook G7 check and queen takes queen mate. Or I can play queen F7 check and queen takes queen mate. So you can't take the bishop on H5. Play queen H6, queen F6. If you take, I checkmate you. If you take with the pawn, then I take your queen. Although maybe rook G3 check is better than taking the queen. Yeah. Truth hurts. F4, queen F7, checkmate. So that was an example where white had the two bishops played D5, opening up his bishop on C3. It reminds me of a famous game, D5 opening up the bishop with this kind of pawn structure. And that's the game Kasparov versus Portish from Niksic, 1983. So if you want to go to the internet and look up that game, you'll see a similar attack by Kasparov where he sacrifices his D-pawn, which in this game wasn't captured, and he opened up his bishops, and he ended up having Portish's king go for a king walk. If you like king walks, you're really going to like the game Kasparov, Portish, Niksic 83, because Portish's king walks all the way up the board with Kasparov sacrificing every move. But it was the same idea. White played D5, opened up the diagonal for his bishop, and attack was too strong. That was some examples of hanging pawns. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they get attacked, sometimes you push them and you get past pawns, open up your pieces, and the way you get better at playing both sides of them is by playing both sides of them and seeing which side you prefer, which has better results for you, and analyze your game with an engine and see what the engine says you're playing it right. That was a pretty devastating win against a world-class player like Paul Keres, one of the greatest players of all time. I'm Grandmaster Ben Finegold. That was our Hanging Pawns lecture. I want to thank our sponsor, Shane. If you want to sponsor a lecture, look at my wife's details, Karen, in the description of the video, and that'll explain to you how to sponsor a lecture. Thanks for watching, everybody. Please like and subscribe and leave a comment. Helps the channel out tremendously. I'll see you guys next time with more weekly lectures. Bye.